you've got some elk, deer, even lean beef, you're wanting to make some jerky out of it, I've got the best recipe for you. Everybody in the family has different flavor preferences. I've got kids that don't like spicy jerky. I like spicy jerky. My wife likes sweet jerky. You go through this long drawn out process to make 20, 25 pounds of jerky, and then one family member eats it all over the next 4 years because the other family members don't like the flavors that you put in there. So the process that I do here is one, very simple. I just use a dehydrator, no sophisticated equipment, very simple marinating time, simple recipe. The second step that I use, it allows you to flavor each batch of jerky however you want. And that could be a half pound of jerky for one kid, 2 pounds of jerky for another, 4 pounds for another. You can do a pound of spicy jerky, 3 pounds of sweet jerky, 5 pounds of somewhere in between, and it doesn't matter because the process allows you to do that. All right, so first thing I'm gonna do is run through what you need for this process. The main piece of equipment that you're gonna need for the drying process is a dehydrator. I'll put a link down below on Amazon where you can get one, very inexpensive. These are basically our flavor ingredients. And then we have essentially our marinating base. This is gonna include some sort of teriyaki base. In this case, I'm using soy vey. You can use Yoshida's, Worcestershire, pepper, liquid smoke. If you wanted to smoke the meat in this process during the drying process, no problem. I do that sometimes. I just have a big smoker that works pretty well too. I'll stick a link down below if you want to do it that way. And then you need a little brown sugar. You need a mixing pan, of course some mixing spoons and a cup just for measuring. And then you need glass marinating dishes. Don't use aluminum. The other thing you're gonna need, particularly if you're not a barbecuer, you may not have this, before you start this process, you got to have a good basting brush. This is going to come in to play at the end when you get the kids involved, when you're actually doing the flavoring of the small batches. Of course, the only other thing you need is you need some meat. I prefer to use wild game meat just because it's naturally leaner. If you are going to use beef for this recipe, that works too. But just realize jerky is really more conducive to the leaner cuts of beef. On wild game, I tend to use the bottom rounds. So on the hip quarters, the rear quarters, when you're boning out a quarter, you can imagine the ball joint looking at you. The bottom round is going to be the big piece of flat, elongated meat on the bottom of the round, on the bottom of the quarter. Not really that useful for steaks or roast. You can grind it, but a good way to use it is jerky because it comes out in these big flat chunks like this, right? You can see this. They've got, you know, pretty significant grain on it, which is fine in jerky, but you've got these nice, clean, flat chunks, and that makes it much easier to cut, and you can get nice long pieces of jerky. I just think cosmetically and just the nature of jerky as a snack, it's nice to have long pieces. So I like the bottom round. You can use the shoulders also. You have to clean up all the fat, all the sinew on the cuts of meat that you're gonna use. You don't wanna dry fat on your jerky. It'll go rancid, but also particularly with wild game, it'll give the jerky an off taste. If you leave fat or tallow on the meat when you dry it out when it comes to wild game, you're gonna notice that gamey taste much, much more. Like even right here, you can see this little chunk of fat right there. That needs to be trimmed off, the little bitty pieces. If you get that in your mouth on dry jerky, you're gonna be like, whoa, that tastes like a mule deer, that tastes like an elk in a negative way, not a good way. So I like to trim everything off. These are pretty darn trimmed up, but what I'm gonna do is after I slice them, I'm gonna give it another trim, make sure I get all the sinew, all the tallow, all the fat off. Guys, biltong, okay? I have been obsessed with this stuff for 3 or 4 years. Ever since I got on a keto, carnivore, paleo-esque type of diet, I've had a hard time finding healthy snacks. Biltong is a great option, particularly the slabs that have this fat on the side. That's where your energy is if you're a fat burner like me. Super simple ingredients in this, guys. Literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ingredients. Compare that to your gas station jerky. A great snack in the backcountry or just day to day. Biltong Depot is a huge supporter of my content. Go to their website, biltongdepot.com. Use my discount code CLIFFG, CLIFFG for 15% off at checkout and to support this content. Thanks, guys. And a huge trick here with these is to partially freeze them. So before I'm gonna slice them up for jerky, I throw them in the freezer the night before. The next morning, I'll set them out, let them start to defrost a little bit. You want them exactly like this, where they're cold to the touch and they're frozen in the center, and they'll slice way better. I'm gonna use a meat slicer, and I'll show you guys that. Again, I'll put a link down below where you can get that meat slicer. It's an economical one, but you don't need one. You can just do this with a knife. You can slice the meat, but slicing the meat is a super important part of the process. I'm gonna adjust it to roughly 1/4 inch, just eyeball it. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter how thick you do it. It is gonna affect the taste a little bit because the thicker the meat and the longer you marinate it, like all of that's gonna interplay in terms of how kind of rich that teriyaki taste is. But honestly, 1/4 of an inch thick, whatever, that's gonna be about right. The key thing is what I was talking about, is to be consistent. And one of the key ways to do that, you're not gonna be able to do it all the time, but if you've chose the right meat and you've got it partially frozen, you wanna go across the grain. So if you look at this meat right here, you see these long grains on this round that way. I'm gonna wanna cut this piece across the grain like this, right? That's gonna make it so somebody can tear the jerky apart in their mouth a lot easier. But the thing is, you can see this seam right here, the grain is different here. So you wanna keep the thickness as you go, but you're also gonna have to move the piece of meat around a little bit so you can consistently cut across that grain. And one of these meat slicers, if you're doing it very much at all, it's worth it just for the sake of consistency. It is a whole lot easier to be consistent. It's also just less fatiguing. And this is also where the whole thing with using partially frozen meat comes into play. The partially frozen meat makes life way easier in terms of trying to keep the thickness the same. So this is ready to marinate. All right, so the numbers that I'm gonna give you on this are based on 10 pounds of meat. You can adjust it accordingly. I'll put the actual recipe down in the description below so you don't have to follow along. And I admittedly am pretty rough about it. On these marinades, it doesn't matter. And the reality is you're gonna get a little personal preference, right? You might use a little more Worcestershire, you might use a different teriyaki base, whatever. But what I'm doing right here is creating a teriyaki base for the jerky. And this is a flavor that people universally associate with jerky. Any gas station jerky, any jerky that's commercially sold has a teriyaki base. And that's why I divide this into the marinade versus the process I'm gonna show you later in the video. Everybody's gonna like this. Everybody's gonna expect this out of jerky. So just marinate it with this teriyaki base and then we'll go to step 2. So first you need to have some sort of teriyaki base. In this case, I'm using soyve. Everybody's gonna have their personal preference. I like Yoshida's. You can't get it everywhere. It doesn't have like the little seeds here. What are they? These are sesame seeds. Some people like the sesame seeds, some people don't. Yoshida's doesn't have it. It doesn't really matter. If you look at the ingredients, they're pretty much all the same thing. And one thing about if you're using this soyve instead of Yoshida's, because it has the sesame seeds in it, if you're mixing multiple bottles, you have to mix it up good. Or what you're gonna do is, because I only need to use like, I don't know, maybe like 1/5 of this bottle, but if I don't mix it up really good, you're just gonna pour a bunch of sesame seeds in there, which is not a big deal, but if you want it to be consistent, make sure you mix it up real good. For 10 pounds of meat, 28 ounces of soyve in this case, or Yoshida's. Now the next thing you need is Worcestershire sauce. And it's basically 1/5 amount. So if you want to do it by parts, you could do 5 parts teriyaki base, 1 part Worcestershire, and you'll be pretty close. In this case, I got it measured out for 10 pounds. It's gonna be 2/3 of a cup. The numbers I'm giving you are based on the normal sodium level Worcestershire sauce. If you're using the low sodium, you're gonna have to use more. Can get a little distorted, so just keep that in mind. Jerky's salty, so in my view, it's not a place to be low sodium, like who cares? But you gotta adjust your recipe accordingly. So you've got the Worcestershire sauce in there. I just do pepper to taste. If you wanna measure it out, you're looking at probably like 1/3 of a tablespoon, 1/2 of a tablespoon for 10 pounds. This is something that you're gonna add later on anyways, if you want it on your specific batches of jerky, so you don't have to be too crazy about it. All right, so liquid smoke. Everybody has a different feel about this stuff. Yes, it's not the most natural thing on earth. So if you want to smoke the meat, go for it. It's just gonna add to the process. You can get a smoker. I do that quite often, but you're gonna need for every 10 pounds, basically a tablespoon and a half of liquid smoke. Don't measure it over your marinade, because if you overdo it and you dump double in there, it'll screw the whole bunch up. And smoke is something that people have a flavor preference for. You know, everybody's gonna expect a smoky flavor in jerky, but not everybody likes a lot of smoke in it. And that's kind of the advantage of this process too, over smoking it. When I smoke meat, I smoke it way more smoky than most people like, than most people in my family like. I can control a little bit better this way. So I'm just gonna put exactly, or roughly, I don't have a half tablespoon here, but a tablespoon and a half of liquid smoke in the marinade, just to add a little bit of a smoky flavor to it. Brown sugar. All right, so for every 10 pounds of jerky I'm gonna marinate, I'm using basically a tablespoon and a half, 2 tablespoons. Mix it up really good, and then we're gonna put the meat in there and start to marinate it. Give your teriyaki base a pretty good swirl again, just to make sure it hasn't like settled. And then what you wanna do is just lay this meat out in basically, you know, single layers. It's not a real big deal, but get it laid out here. Pour a little marinade on it. And if you don't have like standing stuff in there, like these sesame seeds, you can just pour the marinade in and then lay as much as meat as possible in there. And it'll just soak up through the meat. There's not a big issue with that. But when you have the sesame seeds in there, you gotta kind of layer it, or all the sesame seeds will end up on, you know, one layer of meat. All right, so this is ready to marinate. We're gonna stick it in the fridge like that for at least 12 hours before we start the drying process. Ooh, yeah, it smells good. So that's 18 hours or so there. Keys to doing this the right way. There's a couple tricks. So first, on these inexpensive dehydrators like this, the Nesco dehydrators that are cheap, reliable, never had a problem with them. I think I've had this one for like 10 years. Take all your trays off here. Start with one tray on the bottom piece. I like to use one of these fruit leather things on the bottom, just because that's gonna catch the blood in the gunk that drips down. Shouldn't say gunk, but the marinade that drips down, it'll catch that at the bottom. So start with one tray here, get your meat, and the way you do this does matter. You know, have your kids help you or whatever too, but you gotta explain this to them. The meat has to be laid flat, and it can't really be touching other meat. And that's a key component, because if you'll find that if you let the slices of meat touch each other, those little pieces where they touch, they're not gonna dehydrate as well as the other spots, and you're gonna end up with inconsistency. So you wanna lay it on here nice and spread out. Try not to have it overlapping or folded on itself or any of that, and not touching. So as you can see, you can't fit that much on there. So once you got one done, put another one on there. And as you can see, we're still not talking about the individual flavoring that I keep hammering on. We're gonna do that about halfway through the dehydration step here. So it's probably gonna be 2 or 3 hours, and then we'll get into that component of the system. Guys, Cliff's Rod. This is my field sharpener. I created it based on iteration in the field. This is what I need. I can sharpen up my short knives, my long knives, a boning knife, a fillet knife. I built in a sweet handle on here. You can go on the website, pursuitwithcliff.com. In the top right corner, hit shop, hit Cliff's Rod. All the details are there. I've spent a lot of time in the field perfecting this thing. Go check it out, guys. All right, so just some thoughts on these dehydrators is they're super simple. For jerky, go all the way up to the top setting. 160 is what it is. You're gonna throw it on there. One word of caution on these. One, to make sure that, you know, the actual dehydrator's working. You know, it didn't go bad or didn't get moisture on it or something while you stored it for 9 months between now and last season. You wanna listen and hear that fan. So you can hear the fan. If you don't hear the fan, it's not working. Your outlet's not working or the dehydrator's not working. The reason I mentioned that, it's really easy to turn this on and then think, oh, okay, it'll work. You know, it'll be there for 3 or 4 hours. But if the fan's not working, you just ruined the whole batch of jerky, because if you leave this stuff at room temperature for 4 or 5 hours, it's gonna go bad on you. So just make sure you hear that fan That's your gut check. There's no light or anything on these. That tells you that it's on. So we're gonna give it 3 hours, set our timer, and then we're gonna come back, flavor this jerky however we want, in as many ways as we want, and that's the fun part for kids. So I'll show you that next. All right, so slight intermission here, guys. If you wanna do this process quicker and you wanna do larger loads of meat, so if you're doing 50, 60, 100 pounds of meat into jerky, it's nice to have one of these electric smokers. This is an older Masterbuilt. I'll put a link down below for an Amazon link on basically the equivalent. This is like 10, 15 years old now. Super reliable. I leave this thing outside and I really shouldn't. That's why it's got this panel covered up here, all kind of ghetto style. But other than that, it continues to work great. And it's easy to do this. You just set it, it dries out the meat, smokes it. The only thing you need to change in this whole process that I've shown you in this video is just don't put the liquid smoke in the marinade. Instead, we're gonna use mesquite wood chips. We'll put them in here and we'll smoke the meat during this first stage of the drying process. You can go through a whole lot more meat a whole lot quicker with one of these. Now, a key thing that you gotta have is this right here, a cold smoker attachment. Again, I'll put some options down in the descriptions below that are equivalent to this. They've got newer versions of it, but what it does is it's got an area where you can load the chips up in here. And so, two things with this. One, you can put way more chips in it and it's way less maintenance, right? So if you're doing a big load of jerky, I can load this up with a bunch of mesquite chips and it's gonna smoke it for longer. The other thing nice about this is you can control the temp better. So if you wanna do smoked cheese or even this jerky and you're in a hot environment and you're dealing with the temp getting too high or going all over the place, having this smoking attachment out here takes the heating element that actually burns the wood chips and creates the smoke and takes it outside of the smoker. So these things, they're cheap and super useful. I use them to do whole loads of smoked cheese too. You have to have them for smoked cheese or you'll just melt the cheese. All right, Wyatt, show them what it looks like. All right, so this is what it looks like after a couple hours. Yeah, hold on. So that's what it looks like after a couple hours. It's not quite jerky yet. It's still got a little moisture on it. This is when you want to do the small batch seasoning. All right, dude, here. There is an order you want to do it in. So say I'm going to do it in habanero red pepper, right? So I'm going to do a spicy version here. Anything that might fall through and drip through that might burn your little kid's mouth because he doesn't like spicy stuff, you want to do that on the lower layers. For the sake of the kids, we've got 3 little mixing cups so everybody can make their own flavor. All right, so the reason that we're using honey, and I know a lot of people are hesitant because they don't want any more sugar in their jerky than what's in the marinade. It's what's gonna allow the seasoning to stick, right? So if you just put red pepper on the meat right now, or if you put this habanero or any of the other sauces that we're gonna do a buffalo, buffalo wing sauce one, and then we're gonna do a Caribbean jerk style one. And then you can also just do straight honey too. That works too. People like that on jerky. But if you don't use honey, all this seasoning doesn't stick well to the jerky. And that's because we're not going to use a whole lot. We're not marinating it like you would if you were seasoning a whole batch. We're basically just basting it on. You've got to warm up your honey a little bit. Not quite water consistency, just like viscous, almost like, 10W30 oil is basically what you're looking at. It can't be hard. Now, having said that, you don't want to overcook it because honey will scorch. You could add a little water if it's just too viscous. In this case, this habanero is pretty liquidy, so it's no big deal. It'll actually make the honey a little bit less viscous in its own right. So you can see I'm doing like probably 3 to 1, 4 to 1 in terms of honey versus the habanero. While you got the honey warm, mix it up. Get in here and look at this. You can smell it. It smells hot. Next thing, this isn't that complicated, but you gotta know the steps. If you're gonna add anything to it, that is another spice, right? So in this case, I'm gonna add crushed red pepper that is unique to the little batch that I wanna do for me personally. You don't wanna put that in here. I found that doesn't work that well. You wanna baste the jerky with this sticky sauce and then just put a little bit of the dry seasoning on top of it. So come on over here. All right, so it doesn't take a lot. The key to not taking a lot is to make sure you make it potent enough. So that's why I'm using like 5 to 1, right? So just a little bit like this. That's all you need to do. All right, so we're just gonna add a little red pepper here, like that, and you can see it's coming through. That's why you wanna do all your spicy stuff on the first trays. So I'm gonna do 2 trays. What, you wanna baste these? Keep it out of your eyes, it's hot, hot, okay? What are you gonna make?
Buffalo wing sauce.
Okay, buffalo with honey. So you can actually get away with the buffalo sauce without the honey. I have tried that before, and this is kind of a little bit of trial and error. But just so you guys know with the buffalo sauce, probably because it's already got some sugar in it, you don't need the honey. It's kind of sticky by itself. One thing about the buffalo sauce is sometimes it'll leave like a little bit of a white residue, and it's just a cosmetic thing. So this one here, these kind of marinades that are almost like a salad dressing type of viscosity, you gotta add honey or they won't stick very well. We just put a little dose. All right, go ahead and load them back up here. All right, so a tip for you, because as you can see, like the kids are going through different flavors. If you've got a whole bunch of meat, on your first run in the hydrator, because these things can't do that much meat. So if you got 30 pounds of meat, you're gonna have a bunch of different runs in here. On the first run, just do a different flavor and just bite the bullet on each layer. Just do a different flavor. This is a trick to keep them in order because it is hard to tell. As I labeled mine, I got numbers on it. So you might just take a notepad and write like number 5 is jerk chicken. You know, number 2 and 4, because they've been out of order now, but they're still labeled. See, 2, 4, those are spicy. Now we're gonna put this back on. We're gonna dry it out for, you're just depending on, you want it to look like jerky, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. You don't want any moisture in there. So we're gonna throw it back on 160. It's probably gonna be an hour and a half, something like that. Might be a couple hours depending on the thickness of the meat. But you wanna taste it after the first run, have everybody taste it, and then you can key in on the flavors you wanna do in the future. And then once you got that figured out, I suggest that on your future runs, do the whole run the exact same flavor. It'll be much easier to keep track of, package up, all that good stuff. So anyways, this will be good for testing in about an hour and a half. Okay, bud?
An hour and a half?
Mm-hmm. It'll be worth it. All right, we're an hour and a half later. It looks about right. Alrighty. What's this one? What number?
5, mine.
Okay, this one is a jerk chicken. It's the best so far by a mile. Don't you think?
Yeah.
All right, so we got it all packaged up here, and you can see we've got spicy for dad. We've got just honey for some of the kids. We got Jamaican jerk.
That's mine.
Okay, cool. All right, so we've got all these different types of jerky. It's super easy to do. You saw the whole process. The great thing about it is you can include your kids in it, and it's easy, and everybody's happy with the end product. So give this system a try on the next deer, next elk you get. If you get some lean beef meat, do some jerky with it. Everybody's gonna be happier. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, and you feel like you got value out of the video, do me a huge favor, like it, subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you guys later.